I'd
Yeah.
like to read a passage from your book, which I found particularly thought-provoking. The study of plain song was virtually the only intellectual discipline known to the ninth century Occident in which a substantial body of material wholly unknown to classical authors had to be brought to order and theorized.
Right.
Would you mind expanding on that a bit?
Not at all. We have medieval from the period you mentioned. We have treatises on geometry, on astronomy, on mathematics, on geography, and most of these books are really recycling what Roman authors already knew. Uh, it's part of the great early medieval act of conservationism,
Right.
gathering material together, looking after it, making sure it's not lost. But with plain chant, you had an extraordinary intellectual odyssey to undertake, whereby you had a whole body of crystallizing melody, which had been unknown to the ancient world. And you had to find a way of talking about it
Hmm.
that was rational, respectable, had its own particular specialized vocabulary, was internally consistent, and was empirical, was actually helpful. And all that had to be done really with only, well, with a wealth of bits and pieces of terminology and concepts gathered together from Roman authors who had never known any of this music.
Hmm.
That's, I think, what I was getting at. It is an extraordinarily intellectual odyssey, and it's a great act of analytical listening. What happens is, certain people with a remarkably analytical quality of intelligence are listening to these melodies hour after hour and saying, that one's like that one, and that one's like that one, and they ended that way, and they started that sort of way. So let's establish a couple of classes of melodies, and then let's establish a third class and a fourth class. Do you see what I mean? They
Yeah.
are listening to what flows through their ear and trying to think analytically and structurally about it. And they had very little guidance from Roman authors to do that.
Yeah, the other passage I wrote down from your book touches on this. You said the materials they inherited encouraged them to listen in many different contexts with more acuity so that they might extend the range of phenomena brought within the scope of writing and articulate thought, which is a pretty stunning notion to think about. That this is, again, as you mentioned, that in for the most part in their science they are depending on ancient authorities,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And they might make a gesture at relying on ancient authorities on music, what Plato said or whatnot. But in fact, when the medievals talk about modes, they're talking about something quite different from what
Yeah.
Plato meant when he was talking about modes. And when we talk about modes, we and use the same names. We're not exactly saying the same things that the medievals said. So it's this real development where, as much as there is a real attempt to respect the classical wisdom, there's also really something new going on.
Yes, and what underlies this is the feeling that if musica is to be a respectable intellectual discipline, it must have analytical, rational, written down texts in Latin that explore it. You have to create a body of textual scholarship. And
Yeah.
and indeed they did it. I mean, from the 8th century onwards, we start to get works of medieval music theory, and on it goes, really.
And would you say that this is music theory on a level that had never been done or at least written down in history
Yes, I would.
before?
Yes, I would, because I mean, in an earlier period, say the 4th or 5th century, you can see that authors are struggling a bit with, they've got some Greek terminology, they've got Boethius on music and so on, but they haven't really brought it to bear upon the music that they hear. They haven't
Right.
created what they would have called a disciplina. They haven't
Practical
created
music theory. Yeah.
they haven't created an intellectual concern. And that's what happens in the 8th and 9th centuries. And it goes on, as you know, into the Renaissance and beyond, and we inherit its legacy.